1984 was an absolutely insane year for heavy metal, and it was also the year when I fell in love with this music. So for me, it all started with Metal Health by Quiet Riot, then followed by Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, Ozzy Osbourne's first solo albums. After that, my album collection grew pretty quickly with Pyromania by Def Leppard, Out of the Cellar by Rat, Bark at the Moon, Motley Crue's Shout at the Devil, Twisted Sister's Stay Hungry, and plenty more. Not bad for a 9-year-old kid who didn't even speak English just 2 years prior. So this year marks my 40th anniversary as a metalhead. And coincidentally, it's also the 40th anniversary of some of the greatest heavy metal albums ever released. Now, even after all these years, it still amazes me just how many incredible albums came out in 1984. And I'm not just talking about personal favorites that hit me as a kid. These were massive, game-changing records that would go on to define heavy metal for decades. And before I go on, I want to list just a few of them to put this video in perspective. The Last in Line, Power Slave, Defenders of the Faith, 1984 by Van Halen, Metallica had Ride the Lightning, Twisted Sister's Stay Hungry, The Warning by Queensryche, Wasp released their debut album, Accept came out with Balls to the Wall, Rat's Out of the Cellar, another debut album, The Dungeons Are Calling by Sabotage, it's an EP, but it still counts. Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate. Deep Purple made a comeback with Perfect Strangers. And there was this unknown Swedish dude who released an instrumental album that just melted everyone's face and completely revolutionized guitar playing. The craziest thing about these albums is that they all sound completely different from one another. You play just a few seconds of any one song and you'll know right away which album it is you're listening to. So what the hell happened, and how did all these records just coincidentally come out in the same 12-month period? Well, as it turns out, there are many reasons behind this phenomenon, and it has to do with both the broader cultural context and some specific events within the music industry. So let's take a look back, and I'll try to answer that question. First of all, we have to look at which point of its evolution the musical genre of heavy metal was around that time. By 1984, the new wave of British heavy metal, which began in the late 70s, had reached a certain maturity. Bands like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Def Leppard were achieving commercial success and plenty of critical acclaim, and this pretty much paved the way for heavy metal to enter the mainstream. This maturity also meant that some of these bands were at the peak of their creativity. Just think of Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, who put out Defenders of the Faith and Power Slave respectively within 8 months of each other. These bands had really fleshed out their sound over previous albums and were now producing some of their best work. Around the same time, thrash metal was emerging as a new, more aggressive subgenre. So you had bands like Metallica, Slayer, and Anthrax that were starting to get more attention with their brand of heavy metal, which featured more speed and aggression, and in some cases, even more technical proficiency. So this made things fresh and exciting, and it attracted new fans. And at the same time, it kept heavy metal from becoming stagnant as even more seasoned artists were inspired to push their boundaries. Advancements in studio technology also played a role.
The numbers all go to 11. Look, right across the board. 11, 11.
With better amplifiers, effects pedals, and recording techniques, bands were able to experiment with new sounds and achieve higher production quality. The guitar tones on Power Slave and Defenders of the Faith were unlike anything heard before, and these improvements helped push musicians to raise their game. 1984 was also a year of major breakthroughs for several bands. Van Halen's 1984, even though it was more hard rock than pure heavy metal, had a big influence on the metal scene, if for nothing else than Eddie and Alex's killer playing. But let's be real, who wasn't rocking out to songs like Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher? Even the most hardcore metalheads couldn't resist those grooves. And then you had Wasp, who released their self-titled debut, and with that, they brought their own brand of shock rock, which pushed those boundaries even further. And let's not forget Twisted Sister, who absolutely nailed it with their choice of singles for their Stay Hungry album. We're Not Gonna Take It, I Wanna Rock, and The Price are incredible songs, and the music videos were just absolutely brilliant. I was just barely 10 years old when those videos came out, but I related to them so much. It was like a unifying force for young metalheads everywhere. And that takes us to another important factor, MTV. So MTV was launched in 1981, and by 1984, it was quickly becoming a dominant force in music promotion. And metal bands were perfectly positioned to take full advantage of this, because they were the ones with the best visuals and the most larger-than-life personas. Not to mention, they had the craziest hair. So how could people not pay attention? Van Halen's Jump and Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It were being played all the time. And that inevitably brought heavy metal to a much broader audience. Especially because these were sort of gateway songs in a way. They're heavy enough to be exciting and different, but still catchy and hooky to be appealing to the uninitiated. On top of that, major labels had come to recognize the commercial potential of heavy metal, so they began to throw ridiculous amounts of money into the genre. And this translated to better quality production, a lot more promotion in stores, on the radio, TV stations, etc., and overall wider distribution so that heavy metal albums were available to a more global audience. So now, heavy metal wasn't just a phenomenon in the UK and in North America. The genre was gaining traction worldwide, and bands like the Scorpions and Accept from Germany were also starting to make their mark. Another thing that bears mentioning is the cultural aspect. Now, by 1984, the initial wave of punk and its derivatives like post-punk and new wave were starting to lose traction. This created a void, which heavy metal bands were in a perfect position to fill, especially because the intensity and the rawness of metal music just really resonated with the younger generation. The youth culture of the early 80s was just ripe for the messages and aesthetics of heavy metal. The themes of rebellion, power, and defiance resonated in a big way with young people of that time, and this helped propel the metal albums released in that year to even greater prominence. You also had the tensions brought on by the Cold War, which contributed to a general sense of anxiety and existential dread. And the dark and aggressive themes commonly found in metal music kind of resonated with many people in a way that was both relatable and cathartic. So with all of these factors coming together, the maturity of the bigger bands, the emergence of new subgenres, the broader cultural context, and the unprecedented industry support, you had the perfect conditions for so many classic albums to be released in the year 1984. But ultimately, I think that perhaps the most important factor of all was the incredible synergy of all these bands in the prime of their youth being highly active all at the same time. Kind of like what you had in Paris in the 1920s. You had the experience of the more seasoned acts and the youthful exuberance of the up-and-comers, one influencing the other, at a time where you had enough technology to create whatever you wanted, but not too much so as to distract you from the goal of writing the best collections of songs that you possibly could. The success of one band often inspired others to raise their game, leading to an ongoing cycle of creativity and innovation as bands all did their best to outdo each other. Although heavy metal was often dismissed by mainstream music critics at the time, 1984 was somewhat of a turning point in terms of the genre gaining more critical recognition. Many albums released in that year are now widely hailed as masterpieces, but some of those were even recognized as such at the time of their original release. So this growing critical appreciation gave heavy metal music a sort of legitimacy, so that it was no longer considered to be just a bunch of noise made by long-haired devil worshippers. Although the Satanic Panic was far from over. I mean, us metalheads were still apparently summoning demons with our album covers and long hair, but that's a topic for another video. And I also want to mention the role that the fandom and community played in the establishment and proliferation of heavy metal music in 1984. Because this was the golden age of things like fanzines and tape trading. And both phenomena played a crucial role in the spread of the music and the immense growth of the heavy metal community. Grassroots efforts such as these were absolutely essential in supporting and growing the genre. And remember, there was nothing like the internet back then. Back then, we didn't have social media to share metal with each other. Just our trusty cassette decks and the not always trusty postal service. Now, if that doesn't scream dedication, I don't know what does. 4 decades later, the albums released in 1984 are still often cited as major influences by later generations of metal bands. Now, this year inevitably comes up when people talk about heavy metal's golden age, and it's often highlighted as a benchmark for measuring the genre's evolution and progress. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, that was the year that I got into heavy metal, so I can't help but feel a strong kinship with all that incredible music. I guess that's why I'm so passionate about sharing what I know about heavy metal, especially when it comes to guitar playing, which I'm clearly and unapologetically obsessed with. You know, the great thing about being a heavy metal fan in 2024 and beyond is that we no longer have to rely on tape trading to share our favorite music with people from all over the world. So I'd love to know, what were some of your favorite albums from 1984? Drop them in the comments below and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned for a lot more licks of the beast.